Okay, guys, welcome to Contracts 101, Part 1. Today we're discussing preparing to write an offer. I'm Tom Fulkerson, your qualifying broker, and I want to thank you for taking the time to join me today. This is the first part of a four-part series that we do every Monday at 1 o'clock, and thanks for being a part of it. So, this particular lesson will address items as if you have never sold a piece of property before. Some of you may have, some of you may have not. So if it's a little elementary for you, please excuse that. This is a checklist of tasks before you write an offer. We would need you to take your DocuSign, FMLS, Georgia MLS training, schedule a buyer consultation and sign the buyer brokerage agreement, discuss compensation payment options with your buyer, check availability, schedule showings through showing time, contact the listing agent to request a pre-showing compensation agreement, which is the F-258 GAR form, obtain a pre-qualification letter from the buyer's lender, do a search of sold comps in the neighborhood, and contact your home inspector to check availability. Those are the 8 steps that we feel are very important for new agents to understand. I probably, when I schedule my buyer consultation, I would probably go ahead and encourage you to speak with that buyer's lender and get a pre-qualification letter before you sign up the buyer. So here is just a graphic of the different things I just went over: DocuSign, FMLS, Georgia MLS. These are the tools that you have as a realtor to help you secure properties for your buyers. And in this particular lesson, we're using a buyer, not the seller. So schedule your buyer consultation with the buyer. I think it's always good to meet someone at the office. I think it's a more professional way to handle it so that you all can have a one-on-one, discuss your compensation, and then get the buyer brokerage engagement agreement signed prior to showing the property. Here is a copy of the buyer brokerage, the exclusive buyer brokerage engagement agreement, which is the GAR form F-110. We've highlighted some important areas on the page 1 of this agreement, including the term. It must have a clear beginning and end. The agency and brokerage that we do not offer are sub-agency and dual agency. The compensation under 4C and 4D. There are 2 little check marks. They're kind of hard to see on my screen. Hopefully you can see it a little bit better than me. It's down about midway. There's 2 little green boxes. So 4C states there must be an amount in the compensation section because you're not going to work for free. But 4D needs to always be checked if the buyer consents for the seller or the seller's broker paid compensation, but this amount cannot exceed the amount the buyer has agreed to pay in 4C. The amount the buyer is committed to paying will be reduced by any compensation that is paid by the seller or the seller's broker. This is important because I have seen agents make mistakes on this where they put in that they're going to get a 3% commission. And then when I review the file, it sees that the seller is paying that and they haven't checked that box, which means the buyer has not consented for the seller to pay those funds. So just be careful about that. It's an important part of your buyer brokerage agreement is the money that you're going to make. Under 4E, the buyer must acknowledge that the seller or the seller's broker is not legally obligated to pay a buyer broker a compensation, and that they should understand their financial obligations going forward under the purchase under contract to purchase property if the seller doesn't offer any compensation. So on page 3, which is the next slide, we have the compensation paragraph for professional services. If the buyer defaults on the terms of this agreement, and the broker finds out prior to closing, the closing attorney can collect the broker's commission from the buyer at the time of closing. We've been very successful with a few of those where we've called the attorney up, and the buyer who may have terminated our agreement or went rogue on our agreement and hired another broker to write a contract for them, wound up paying us our commission. The protection period in the contract is defined as explains the period of time after the termination or expiration of the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement when the broker's compensation rights are protected if the buyer contracts to purchase a property identified during the term of the exclusive buyer brokerage agreement. We have duties to our buyer that include making required disclosures, attempting to locate property, complying with all applicable laws, assist in negotiating, preparing of forms, etc. The buyer also has duties to you, the agent. The buyer agrees to be available, to timely respond, to provide accurate information, to inspect the property, read disclosures, work exclusively with the broker agent, and disclose any previous broker relationships, and not to contact for sale by owners directly. On page 6 of our exclusive buyer brokerage agreement, there are definitions and disclaimers regarding hazardous conditions, holding the broker harmless, no imputed knowledge, definition of notice between broker and buyer. And then we also have a buyer default section that the buyer defaults on the contract or mutually terminates the purchase sale agreement. Buyer unilaterally terminates our brokerage agreement, or buyer enters into a contract where the broker is not paid compensation. Note, only a broker can sue for compensation. Any questions so far?
Yes, Tom.
Yes, sir. Cadario.
Yes, sir. Going back to the compensation section. When you say, okay, no, going back to the time period after the termination of the contract, right? If
Okay.
the if if the buyer you presented to the seller didn't wasn't ready to purchase the property at that time, but waited till the contract expired and then went back to the same seller you introduced him to, him or her to, and purchased the property, how will the agent find out that the buyer did that?
You would have to research and follow the tracking of that particular property. So, in other
Okay.
words, if your buyer decided not to purchase from the seller that you introduced them to,
Mm-hmm.
and you find out through FMLS or Georgia MLS that that property is under contract, then I would call you're going to have to find the information. In other words, you're going to have to track that information and find out if the buyer used another agent, where the closing, where is who is the closing attorney. And then once you know that information, I can call the closing attorney and say, we have a buyer brokerage agreement and we showed this property. We are procuring cost of sale, and we can hold up that closing and negotiate a commission from that buyer.
Okay. Okay.
It's a little bit of legwork because you're going to have to do some legwork to find out, number
Yes.
one, if it's that buyer, that same buyer that went under contract on that property. And you
Mm-hmm.
probably could call up the listing agent and find out. I think that's how our agents have found out in the past. And the
Mm-hmm.
listing agent is safe because they're not representing the buyer. But I think we've gotten that information from listing agents in the past.
But what if the listing agent was well, yeah. Okay, yeah. No, no, the listing agent is not representing the buyer, correct?
You're
Okay.
going to have to find out first of all if there's another agent involved in it. That buyer could have gone directly to the listing agent. Then they're not going to be
Oh,
so forthcoming.
okay, okay, okay.
That
All
answer your
right.
question?
Yes, sir.
All
Thank you.
right. You're welcome. Okay, we're going to move on to page 7 of our exclusive buyer brokerage agreement. And on this page, we have our cyber fraud warning. Beware of fraudulent wiring instructions, seller theft ID, which is pretty rampant, guys, particularly with vacant lots, vacant land, and vacant houses. Um, the brochures you need to provide to the buyers include the GAR CB13. Protect yourself when buying real property. Please note that you must email the exhibits that you are including that are references attached to the buyer when you email the buyer brokerage agreement for signature, but they do not have to be filled out, signed, or initialed, but you must send them. These GAR forms, I can't tell you how important they are, that most agents overlook them. This is free legal advice that are written by attorneys, all of these brochures. So you should use them as much as and often as you can because it's free legal advice for the buyer. All right, and then we have new language for proper legal signatures for entities. On the far right of the screen, you'll see the incorrect way. This is signed the buyer signature RE School of Georgia LLC and the printed name RE School of Georgia LLC and the buyer's email address. The correct way would be Angela Meza Smith as managing member or director or whatever they are. And then the printed name would be RE School of Georgia. So someone has to sign that as a member, director, president. You can't just put the name of the entity or the name of the LLC as the buyer's signature. That's incorrect.
Okay.
On the buyer's acceptance and contact information, we need their email address, their phone number, their current mailing address, the brokerage and agent information, very critical. On the bottom of the form, the name of the brokerage, the broker's license number, the broker's phone number. I don't really require the fax number because we really don't use faxes anymore. Agent's name, agent's license number, agent's phone number, and email address. And please make sure at the bottom, when everything is signed, sealed, and delivered, that you fill in the acceptance date of that form. All right. So that is an overview of our buyer brokerage agreement. The next step, I would say, is if you're getting ready to show and you've got a list of properties, call that listing agent up or email them or text them. Let them know, please, guys, I'm going to do a little sidestep here. When you are texting people, always include your name and your brokerage. Okay. I can't tell you how many texts I get every day from agents with just a question. I have no idea who they are. It's just not very professional. So I want you to be as professional as you can. Always include your name and your brokerage when you are texting back and forth with people. All right, you're going to seek to obtain the F-258, which is the pre-showing compensation agreement from the listing agent prior to showing and are preparing a purchase offer and discuss compensation payment options with the buyer. What I am finding today is that most listing agents are just saying, oh, please just write in the F-259 in your offer. I'm offering X percent. Okay. But if you do get an F-258, make sure that the timing on that form is still valid. It does have an expiration date. And I've had circumstances where agents have written an offer way after the timeline of the F-258 expiration. They didn't include the F-259 in their offer, and guess what? They didn't get paid.
Mm.
At least not from our seller. So here's a copy of the pre-showing compensation agreement. And then if they are offering a percent that's less than what the buyer has agreed for you to earn, you can always just add that F-259 and ask for the compensation that's on your buyer brokerage agreement. And here is exactly what I just said. If there is no pre-showing compensation agreement on the F-258 obtained prior to preparing to write a purchase offer, or the agreement has expired, or the buyer wishes to negotiate the amount of the buyer broker's compensation, then the F-259 broker compensation agreement exhibit may be included with your purchase sale offer. I would always include that anyway, even if you have an F-258, in case that F-258 expires during the term of your under contract. And here is a copy of the F-259 exhibit that you would add to your purchase and sale agreement. Depending on who is paying the compensation, some agents are still collecting the full compensation and sharing it with a buyer broker. But more and more, I'm seeing the seller paying the buyer broker directly. So you will either fill out A or B, depending on what the circumstances is with that listing agent and their listing agreement. And then everybody should sign off on that. All right, so we've done that. We've presented our offer. We're getting ready to, we have not presented our offer, but we're getting ready to write the contract and include all of that in our offer. And you can do a search of sold comps in the neighborhood if you really aren't familiar with value in that neighborhood. In the neighborhood I've lived in, I know value. I don't even have to look at a comp. I know what the comps are, but you may not be that experienced. So it's always good to do a search of sold comps, look at the photos, read the comments on all those comps, because not every house is equal. Not every house has been maintained the same. The location of the property in a particular neighborhood may affect the value. So just beware that you should look at the photos and do a whole lot of research if you're writing an offer in a neighborhood you're not familiar with. All right, and now here's the most important part of what you're going to do with your buyer. Get the pre-qualification letter from the buyer's lender. You want to make sure that your buyer is pre-qualified and that they have applied, have a conversation with the lender, make sure that everything's buttoned up so that you don't have any last minute surprises when they go under contract. This can make or break your deal right here. I always think it's a good idea to contact your home inspector prior to writing your offer, because it may be more beneficial for the buyer to have a shorter due diligence if they're in a situation where there may be competing offers on a particular property. And if you call up your home inspector and say, how quickly could you get to this property if we go under contract? And that way you may be able to win the deal if there is other interest in the property, because maybe you'll come in with 5 days of due diligence and the next person may have 10. And it's only because you've called your home inspector and gotten a date as to when they can get there. All right, that is everything. Are there any more questions about um, preparing to write an offer?
I had a quick question.
Okay, Robert.
So with the F25A pre-shown compensation, so if we have a BBA with our buyer, you still suggest to get that?
Yeah, well, it depends on what your buyer brokerage agreement is. If your buyer says, "I don't want, I'm going to pay you. I don't want the seller to pay you," then you don't need to get that. The F-258 is when the buyer is allowing you to have the seller uh, pay all or part of the compensation.
Okay. Okay, I understand that now then. In that case, so you should do it every single time before you show a house, or can you do it like after, but before you send the offer in?
I would do it always before, because you
Okay.
want to know what that seller is offering in terms of compensation. That's going to help you structure your purchase and sale off your
Yeah,
offer.
so before the offer, but always before the offer, obviously.
Always,
Okay, yeah.
yep.
I
If
was
you're
more
going to show
leaning.
the property, if it was me and I'm going to show a property down the street, I'm going to call that listing agent and say, "I need your F-258." And
Okay,
if they say they're not offering one, just write it into the contract, then write it in the contract on the F-259.
okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions, guys? Okay. Well, as always, contact your broker support team at broker@heartatl.com if you have any questions, if we can help you in any way. Next week, we will have our uh, Contracts 101 Part 2. Angie will be hosting that call at 1 o'clock, and we look forward to seeing you there. Have a
Thank you,
great week.
Tom.
Thank
You too.
you.
Have a good one. Thank you.
Welcome.
Bye. Bye, guys.